And the only thing that they ever really did religiously, I like to joke about, is that they were strong fishermen. So every Sunday, get your poles ready, and you're going to be out on the water catching fish and eating fish and enjoying each other's company. So my mother's side were very strong Catholics. So they, would attend Mass regularly and, did all of the things that were very, what we would call spiritual, religious, where they would do the prayers, they would attend church together. But there were secrets that family held, things that, were, I'll just say for tonight, were very dark things. And those things, as I got more and more involved with that family, that side of the family, those things just kept growing darker and darker and really impacted my life. Before I was introduced to those dark things, we had an incident that greatly impacted my spiritual journey. And I would say it was before I experienced any real pain or trauma. And I can remember being age 2, and our house pipes froze, and we had to move in with one of my dad's relatives. And, they were very, according to their beliefs, very good Christian people. And they went to church and stuff. And I can remember going, and I was the only little kid in the nursery, and I just remember this Mexican woman named Lily. And, she is probably one of the biggest influencers in my spiritual journey because she was just real. She didn't, treat me like a little baby or an infant. She didn't water down spiritual things. She sat me on her lap. She put the Bible on top of our laps, and she opened up to the book of John, which is one of the most profound books in the Gospels, and she started reading it to me. Yeah, that's your name, right? You're named after a good guy, John. So as she started reading that, I can remember that the words that she was reading resonated with my soul, even at the age of 2. And my heart just leaped, and I can remember that feeling of, having something spiritual connect with my soul. And I knew that that's what I wanted. It's like, I know that I want to hear this word. And so, from there, a year and a half later, we moved in with my mother's side of the family. And, they were involved in some very high-level things that involved the U.S. government and military. And, part of that dark side of things that they were involved in dealt with children and human trafficking, child trafficking, the use of our government and military using children as spiritual weapons is probably the best way I can describe it, where, they would put us through tests and studies and discover what our gifts were. Could we see visions or dream dreams? Some, could see things that would happen in the future. And, then they would use that information to dictate things that they were going to do in our government. And, really it was a lot of abuse that was happening at a physical and spiritual level. No child should have to see other kids being abused or taken advantage of. And I watched as, not just myself, but other children, world leaders would come in to these meetings and they would buy, sell, and trade children based on their spiritual gifts. And so, this was part of the hidden secrets of my life. Starting at age 5, I tried to tell everybody that I could tell that these things were happening, and all I would get were closed off ears. I would barely get a word out, and people would say, stop lying, start telling the truth, or we don't want to hear it. And nobody would listen to what I had to say. So, that began the struggle with my spiritual journey, where I didn't always know, who could I trust? Who could I, who could I connect with to change the situations that I was involved in? And, at that point, I went to teachers, I went to pastors or people at the church. One time we were at a haunted house. And at that haunted house, my relative who was a little older than me, who was there with me, she got scared. And so she decided, that she was going to tell me that I was scared and that she was going to carry me through the haunted house to comfort me. So she was carrying me through, and as we got towards the end of the haunted house, there was this cage with a skeleton in it. And that skeleton it would like grab out as you pass by. And so as we passed by, the skeleton grabbed out and it got stuck around my ankle. And we couldn't get it off. And so then the haunted house staff came and they couldn't get it off either. So they had to call in maintenance guys to come and shut the whole haunted house down. They had to take the whole skeleton and the cage and everything apart. And then, as they're doing that, I see these three men that I know were not connected with my family or the community that were involved in the things that I was enduring. So I began to blurt out to these three guys, everything that's going on. And their eyes were just big, like, is this part of the haunted house? Is this kid for real? And, when that was happening, then one of my family members came around the corner and heard, what was going on, and they immediately stopped me from being able to tell anymore. So from that point, I went probably until, through my teen years and stuff, just with this experience of, all this spiritual baggage. And I felt so confined in my soul. Like, I went from a place where spiritually I was being exploited, where I couldn't trust people. I couldn't, really be free to enjoy spiritual things, to, now I have to be silent. I can't say anything about my spiritual journey to anybody. And, as a kid, that was a very confusing time. And what I realized about that is that, all of us, we all experience traumas in life. We experience things that cause both not only physical wounds, but spiritual wounds. And we live in a society where there aren't a lot of individuals who openly are addressing those spiritual wounds. I'll just be honest, a lot of the churches, a lot of the religious institutions, if somebody comes forward with a spiritual wound, they want to hide it under the rug. They want to pretend like it's not there. And so, for me, one of the big breakthroughs came in a very unexpected way. As I continued through my life in this, I'll just call it a very long stage of silence, I was studying to be a chaplain, and I was having to minister to, veterans and people in the hospitals who were enduring crisis. And it was like, how do you minister to people who are experiencing all these traumas, all this crisis, and yet you're just kind of like bound up in yourself, and you can't fully share who you are. And so, I began to wrestle with the Lord about that. And, I had been taught through the churches and the institutions that I went to what my spiritual journey is supposed to look like. And I tried to attain that, but did I really feel that I had attained what I wanted to experience? I didn't. I felt really trapped inside. And a lot of that feeling of being trapped was because of the spiritual wounds that I carried that nobody wanted to see or address. And so, as I continued on my journey, the Lord brought me to that place where He said, we're going to address these wounds. And it happened, my entire, I'll say probably starting around age 15, I was somebody that it helped me to process my spiritual life through journaling. So I would keep track of all my prayers. And, so since age 15 up until that point, which was almost 25 years, I had been journaling all my prayers. And out of that, only 5 of those weren't answered. So, it was a pretty good track record. I was really happy seeing results, in the type of journaling and prayers that were going on. So one day, I had a church that I was attending, and I'll say he's a great pastor of this church, and he was somebody that I looked to as a spiritual mentor. But the one morning, I'm writing down all my prayers, and the Lord says to me, I want you to give your prayer journal to the pastor. I'm like, wait, what? No, why in the world would I give my prayer journal, which, has all my dirty laundry? It's like, why would I give that to the pastor? And the Lord just said, no, you need to give it to the pastor. And I can remember, I was just like, I probably prayed for like a week. I was like, Lord, is that really your voice? Maybe that's a voice in my head. I don't know where that voice was coming from. But I was trying to fight and wrestle because I didn't want to give that open sharing. And why was that? Because as a kid, every time I tried to share, I immediately was shut down. People would call me liars. They would say, stop joking, stop telling lies, be real. And so I was afraid of more wounds. And so, finally I made the choice that, okay, even if this now causes more wounds, I'm going to share. And so, I called my pastor and said, hey, the Lord wants me to share something with you, and I'm just going to ask you to take my prayer journal home for a couple of weeks, read it, and give it back. And, I can remember those couple weeks, there was so much stress. It was like, what is he going to think? I was having issues with, at the time, my youngest son. We were at a place with him. He was having high behaviors. He was running away. He was, I literally was having to restrain him in his anger for a couple hours every single night. And on top of that, I had had multiple, shoulder surgeries. And so there was so much pain that I was having to deal with every night. And, my pastor was aware of some of these things. The church had been praying, but what they didn't see was really my heart. All the crying out, saying, Lord, deliver me out of this situation. God, help my son. make that change, whatever needs to happen. They didn't see the frustration or the anger, that I was so angry that I had to work all day, come home and spend all night, physically fighting with my son, and that I didn't have other people who were really supportive in my life. I had people in the church praying, but what I really wanted was just somebody to help. And there was no one who would come and help me deal with this child that was out of control. And I didn't have control of the situation. I didn't have what I felt I needed during that time. And, there was anger. There was anger at the people in the church because it's like, why will nobody come and help me? And why do I have to go through this alone? And so, there was more that was all in there. But it was that realness of my heart that I didn't want to have judged. And so what was interesting, I expected, he's a good man, and I knew he wouldn't say mean things or cruel things, but there were still those thoughts that go through one's head, where it's like, is he going to think I'm a bad mom now because I can't control my son, but I'm trying to handle work plus him. Am I not good enough? Am I not worthy enough? So you start to go down those thoughts in your spiritual journey with your trauma. And you bring on all these negative things. As that trauma increases, you bring more negativity into that situation towards yourself. And it outpours in your relationship with other people. And so I was realizing all this was going on. And so with that, I just realized there was so much withholding. And what did my pastor do? He gave back my journal. He said, "Thank you." Never said another word. So, that left me in an uncomfortable spot because I didn't know what he thought. And so from there, all of that was the catalyst for something bigger. I had to go through that point of learning to be vulnerable. That's a word that many of us don't like to think about. We don't want to be spiritually vulnerable with others. But, as we look at Russell's work, I'd encourage everybody to walk through, you see that there's this openness in his work that he clearly displayed in his own way through art, through science. He displayed that spiritual journey that he took. And he was very vulnerable with it. He didn't withhold his heart. And so for me, when I saw that, it really deeply impacted my life. Because a lot of what he draws and put up there resonated with my own personal spiritual journey. And, so with all that, the Lord took me to a place where I had to be even more vulnerable. So I think it was probably about a year, almost 2 years after I was at that point where I'd given over my journal, then the Lord says to me one day, "You're going to share your story." And I thought, well, maybe it would be, one-on-one with people as I met them. But no, the Lord had a much bigger plan. And he literally meant I would be sharing it with the world, through the different radio shows, federally, because I had witnessed trafficking and crimes against children. The Lord gave me individuals who were willing to listen. They were willing to hear about the trauma that happened, and they were willing to do stuff about it, to attack the problem. And so if I hadn't come to that place of trust and vulnerability in my spiritual walk, I would have missed out on, the solution that brought resolve to some of those issues and problems. So I think I'd like to end there tonight, and encourage people as afterwards, after a time of questions, we're going to stop the Zoom and we'll go in there, and I would just like to walk through and share about some of Russell's stuff. Okay, got more?
Another 18 minutes before you go to Q&A.
Okay, gotcha. I thought you were saying get close to done. So with that, I would like to share about some of the artwork that Russell has done. It's very powerful, and there's things in there where he really draws out, how do you get to that place of allowing your spirit to freely operate? In our world, in our society here, from a young age, they begin to shut our spirits off. Children go to kindergarten and preschool. They may have imaginary friends. They may have dreams. They may see things in the spirit world. And what do their teachers say? Well, that's just a dream, or that's not real. They may be seeing or sensing things in the spirit world, and immediately an adult will say, that's just in your imagination. And so, to come to this place and to be able to see that we are physical and spiritual beings. We not only see with our physical eyes, but we also see with our spiritual eyes. We hear with our spiritual ears, and we feel with our spirit body. But there's such a disconnect we're taught in this world. We don't really understand how to live as who we are, that we are 100% physical, and we are 100% spiritual, and we're meant to live in both a physical and a spiritual world. And so how do we get to that place? I think it first starts with we have to recognize that not just the church, but our schools, our education system, our, science system, our art system, they've begun to separate or categorize, where you've got these little boxes. The first box is the spiritual box, where in that spiritual box, it's told to you what is considered spiritual. You're spiritual if you go to church. You're spiritual if you believe in God, or if you have a specific faith, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever other ones are out there. Those things go in that spiritual category. Everything else goes in that physical category. You have the mind, you have the emotions, you have your will. But there's a big space in between the two. And it's that big space that we have to break through. Because you have to have movement between the two in order to have that catalytic action between the physical and the spiritual world. And so it's learning that movement within yourself. And it starts within yourself. That movement is an energy that we all naturally have. But within that, if we confine that energy, like I was doing at first, others were doing it for me as well, by silencing me, not allowing me to talk or express my feelings or my emotions. It was confining that energy and stopping the movement of it. And so, if we want to have that wholeness, we have to get past everything that causes that motion to stop. And so as you're dealing with things in your life, it might be past traumas or pain. And with pain, it doesn't just mean emotional pain. It can be physical pain too. I don't know if anybody here has ever had, severe physical pain that you deal with chronically. Those things can take away and drain that spiritual movement as well. So as you learn to take those things that I call them withholders, because we put all of our attention and energy on those things. And, I love some of the pictures out there because they have little arrows. And I think, how real is that? That he even documented the flow of energy. And so when I put it into that context, I look at, if I want to have a relationship with God and I want to have a relationship with others, I want this movement in my spiritual life that is circular, where it's a give and it's a receiving. But if I'm focused on my pain, my energy is kind of turned this way, and I'm not focusing on God or others. And so we literally have to be able to redirect that energy movement. And that's where the being vulnerable comes in. One of the experiences that I had with that, I went through a very scary time before all my shoulder surgeries. I had a gallbladder that was acting up. And I tried everything to save it naturally. I went through 3 years of this extensive diet. It was horrible. Literally, I had to drink like a half a cup of olive oil every day with a half a cup of grapefruit juice, fresh squeezed, just to try to get the stones to all pass. I passed over 81 stones. And in that 3-year period, and then one day, it decided to go into this tight squeeze. I was hunched over in horrific pain. I was at a job that I would say, we'll just call it the job from hell. I had a boss that wouldn't listen to me. And when I told her I had to have emergency gallbladder surgery and said, is it okay if I leave? She just turned around, walked into her office and closed the door with no answer. Now, I came from, Scandinavian German family, so you didn't ever just walk away from a job. You needed permission before you left if you still wanted that job. So I continued to work with this gallbladder that's in acute pain. Finally, the surgeon who was at the hospital came and he's like, what are you doing? You get up to the emergency room right now, get on that bed, and you're going to get some drugs. And I was like, but I don't need all that. And he's like, go right now. And then I had my boss come and tell me that I wasn't excused from work, that I didn't have permission to leave and I needed to return to work immediately. And it was like, I can't, And so, I was in this acute pain and I was terrified. I was terrified to be put under, to not know if I was going to live or die through the situation. And, I went through all that. Everything went fine. 4 weeks later, I'm working again. And I walk into this room, and this woman who was there just breaks down in tears. And I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, I am terrified. I have to have emergency gallbladder surgery, and I've never had surgery before. And I said, I just went through that. And she's like, really? And I'm like, yeah. And, I probably did something I probably shouldn't have done, but I even showed her my scars. And, I opened up my heart, and I was vulnerable with her. And so she went and had her surgery. When it was done, she called me to come back. And she said, I just want to thank you. She said, I needed that. I needed to hear that I would be okay. I needed to see someone who went through that experience and who lived through it to know that I would be okay. So she was like, thank you for sharing that with me. So as I did that, I could have, just stayed in my own little bubble. I could have just said, well, let me pray for you. And she would have still felt all uneasy, nervous, afraid, But because I stepped out, I reached out in every direction, that energy continued. And she received what she needed, and it also encouraged me. And, that energy flow kept going. So with that, as I said earlier, all of us have that trauma, that pain, those experiences. And in order, to get past those hindrances, the things that keep us from being ourselves, we have to be willing to be vulnerable with each other. And sometimes, that might mean that there will be more pain or there will be more hurt, because not everybody's on the same page. There are some people who just are not nice. I'll put that way. But if we never take the chances to be open and available, we'll never know what the full extent of the reach of our spiritual walk is. And our spiritual walk is not just meant for us, it's meant to be shared with the world, because we are all one, we are all together. And, so I want to encourage you that as you go through things, pause for a moment. And as you meet people, in your conversations, listen for things that they're saying that resonate with your own life's journey. And as you hear things, take that risk. Take that opportunity to speak into their life and say, I had an experience very similar to that. I had a childhood that had a lot of pain and suffering. Or, even in my situation later, I was a parent who was dealing with a child that was out of control, and not being afraid to admit that to others who are having those same struggles, saying, I've been there. How can I help support you? And as we do that, we start to see things move. And we find that joy, that release in our spiritual walk, and we can really be who we are when we minister out of what we've come through. So I titled this segment, Love Unbound Becomes Love That Abounds. As we, have love that is unbound in the sense that it's lost, it has withholders on it, it has blocks. As we move that into something that is moving, it becomes that love that abounds as we minister out of our pain, our trauma, and our suffering. So with that, I'm just going to thank you all for coming, and we're going to, I guess we'll keep the Zoom on while we do the question, but we're going to move to a time now where if you have questions that you'd like to ask, I'll open it up for that. So maybe, yeah.
I love art to where you finally realized that you had to turn it over to God.
Yeah.
And isn't that the familiar tune, right?
Right.
And people, I'm not saying that in your case, that you bottomed out, but there are people that, they have to bottom out before they'll turn to God, turn to their spiritual self to reach out and get that help. And so it sounded like you had to be prompted a couple of times, but you finally
little hard-headed and had to,
But that's wonderful.
wrestle.
I'm so glad that
Thank
you
you.
found some peace and happiness through that. That's wonderful.
Thank
Jessie.
you.
Jessie, I was curious, when you first walked in the museum and you saw the paintings and you saw everything that was on the walls, it seemed to possibly give you voice for some of the things that you explained, because you were just explaining some of the very dynamics that Walter Russell was teaching us. Why do you think being exposed to some of those would be helpful for people to learn the power of the seen and the unseen?
For me, yeah, it really resonated. And I did feel like, not just that, I think how to put it into words here, but I think when you're silenced and under so much oppression, a lot of times there's things that we just don't have words for. We don't have the language to put it into words. And because I had never been allowed to express or talk to others about my experiences, I really didn't have the words for it. And so when I walked in here, all of a sudden, it was like there were these images that put into words my life story. And it was like, oh my goodness, like he gets it. He understands exactly what I went through. And so to see that for the first time is so moving. When I didn't have a way to share with the world some of my experiences. But then to come and to be able to find the words because it's there in somebody else's imagery, and they have found a way to express it. They found a way to, through art, through science, to put all the information there in place that gave me the language and the words that I needed to be able to express, what I had to share with the world. So very powerful. Yeah.
So, Jessie, you mentioned that the children were assessed for their gifts.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what your experience was like with that. What did you know or discover within yourself about your spiritual essence?
I was a very strong fighter. So, I had to laugh because I also was kind of a humorous, snarky child. As the military and others are doing these spiritual gift tests, it's very professional. There's a certain way you have to posture yourself and act and behave. And, they would start off by asking us to pick items. Like they would have a group of items and you would be asked to pick one thing. And that one thing was what resonated most with you. And, I was the child that didn't pick what was available because I saw beyond. I saw into the spirit world. So I literally was the kid that picked the sword, and they were like, what is that? And I'm like, what does it look like? It's a sword, right? And that was when they realized I could see and, perceive things in the spirit realm, and that there were things that were accessible in that realm that I could connect with and, draw their attention to. So I wasn't, confined to all the things that all their little boxes. It's like, I don't want to play that game. I don't want to be in that box. So I'll do something else. And, I would think of the different opportunities. So very strong warrior, fighter, but also a peacemaker. I learned that I had a lot of conflict resolution skills at a very young age. My natural instinct was to be the peacemaker in every situation because that's what got the best results. But that was not who I truly was. That was just the default I used because it worked. My real, conflict resolution style was to fight. And so when the peacemaker didn't succeed, then that's when the warrior, the fighter would come out to make things, happen the way that they should. So those were some of my spiritual gifts.
My question for you is, it had to be incredible to witness what took place with other children. And then the bidding, the auctioning, whatever took place with other children. What was going through your mind when you witnessed that? Did you think that it was your time? Am I going to be auctioned off? Where am I going to end up? Did that go through your mind? I mean, did you struggle with that at all? Or?
It did, yeah. There wasn't as much, I'll say there wasn't as much fear. The natural reaction that I had, and partly because it was very controlled situation. So I had to watch, I couldn't turn away. So it's like you're seeing these horrific things happen. And my natural reaction was responsibility. I felt responsible to do something. But at the time, I couldn't do anything. So, it left this very helpless feeling. But with that, then it really stirred, I'll say, the justice in me, where it was like, okay, I'm not going to forever be silent. I'll find a way to tell. And therefore, I continued to try to tell in every situation I was in so that those kids could get out and the things that I saw would stop. So it kind of stimulated, that righteous anger and justice in me. But, yeah.
Glad you're here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, this question comes from one of our Zoom attendees. Sydney asked, can you mention a specific painting that had the effect of expressing your life?
Yeah, I don't know what exact one it's called, but it's out there. It's the one, it specifically has I'll say the square, and one side's red, the other side's blue, and then it shows the spiritual dimension experience that they were having. And so for me, that one was probably the most meaningful, because that was the first one that I saw where it was like, oh my gosh, this is my life. Like, he's expressing what I learned, and what was called equilibrium, where you have two forces that are constantly, they're at war with each other, they're separate, usually represented with the colors red and blue, yet they are one, and one's male, one's female. They work together, yet they are completely separate. And through that, they experience that spiritual journey together. Like it's not just you alone going into the spirit world, but you have another person who's there with you. And I don't want to, the closest word I can come to is almost like twins or a shared soul, where you realize that your soul is not, it's not just you in the universe alone, but you're part of this bigger picture on the same plane with someone else. And you can be completely different, yet you're still one. And so that's a beautiful imagery. It's, I think, like the third or fourth one in that museum hallway there. Yeah.
I believe it's the wave that you're referring to from your description of it, the octave wave. It's
Probably.
Thank you.
Well, my mom's not here right now, but I know if she was here, she'd be asking this, because she just told me a quote of yours about how you talked about how, like, the devil has to go to God to ask permission to, roam and just live and spread what, evil does. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Yep. So that was part of my spiritual experience, was that the enemy has to always go to God for permission for what he wants to do. And I would experience things, where he and these evil people would constantly be going for permission to do the evil things that they wanted to do. But what was missing was that we also have the right to ask permission for the good that we want to do. And, the church has not prepared people for things like that. It tells us that when we die, we will go to heaven. But it never talks about, can we experience heaven now? Do we have the right in our spiritual state or in our prayers to go before the throne of God and ask permission and rights to do all the good works that are on our mind and our heart to do? And we do have that right. So, I encourage people to, I think in some of my shows with Right on Radio, I get into that discussion more, where I talk about, how do we access the heavenly realms? How do we ask for permission and get those spiritual permits to be able to do the good works that we want to do? And then how do we get from, when you start off asking permission, it's in the spirit world. So, you're manifesting things in the spirit world. But how do you get it from there to where it's manifesting here on earth and you're seeing the results that, you're asking the permissions for? So I also have on rightonU.com, and that's just with the letter U, rightonU.com, I have one of my courses in there, Dominion and Authority. So that course addresses a lot of that work in the spirit world, where you can get permissions and stuff for the things that you want to see happen. Thank you. Good question.
Yes, another quick question. Somebody mentioned the other day that you might have worked with portals before. Okay, so you know about portals and ley lines and vortexes, energy vortexes. Anything specific you could share with us that might have happened at a portal you worked on?
Yeah. So my first experience through that was at the U.S. Military base in Chicago. And the military works extensively with, I call them spiritual gates, but they call them portals, they call them, time travel, access portals, all sorts of different names. But with that, I had top military generals that, would at first were teaching me how to walk through those spiritual gates. And so, the first one, I'll say he was one of the generals that was very soft-hearted. That's probably why they had him work with me, because I didn't like a lot of the other ones. And if I didn't like them, I would be stubborn and just not go through the gate. But then I would take it a step farther. I would ask the Lord to close the gates altogether, and then nobody could use the gate. It would be closed. So, they got this general that I liked. And so, he took my hand and we walked through the gate, and we ended up on the outside of, I'll just say, heaven, where, we were in this field with lots of flowers. And he looked at me because he knew that that's not where that gate went to. And he said, "Where are we?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Why did you bring us here?" I said, "Well, because it was peaceful." So that was my first experience. How old were you? I was 5 years old. Yeah.
The reason I asked that question, we just spent the weekend in Mount Shasta with Peter Moon. Have you ever heard of Peter Moon? Okay. Written a lot of books on Montauk and some with Radu Sinmar on Romania, and if you know what's in Romania with the holographic projection rooms. That was what I was leading up to. Have you had any experience with Montauk or the Romanian?
I was not part of Montauk. The experiments that I was part of were the Looking Glass, Stargate, Star Wars Now, and then the Voice of God projects.
Okay.
Also some of the Phoenix and some of the other sub-projects that were connected with those. I did, I'll say, cross paths with several of the boys that were being used for those Montauk projects. So our training and our experiences were very similar in some ways. You just had different military generals who were over those programs working with the kids. So yes, those children were used, we'll just say spiritually abused. Crimes were committed against them in the operation of those spiritual gates. With the other one, I wasn't privy to that.
That's Romania you're talking about, right?
Right.
Right.
But we did work with other countries. So, the country that I was probably at the most was Germany. So very connected with the spiritual gates there. My job was to be able to access their 7, we'll say, ancient gates, which are very large spiritual gates. My job was to hear the song that each of those gates were tuned to, and to open all 7 at one time for the military. So it was a little bit different focus. The other programs you're talking about, they deal more with the smaller gates, where they're accessing, horizontally according to the ley lines, transportation from point A to point B. The ones that I worked with were interdimensional.
Thank you. I didn't want to get too far off topic, so maybe we'll talk later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions. All right.
Yeah, I think.
There's no more questions. Thank you all for coming, and we'll stop the Zoom now, and then I would love if we just have a few minutes. We can go in there, and some of the questions I'm sure you'll have, will come out as we walk through. Yeah, thank you.
And that is why I say that this course of lectures is to give everyone the knowledge of God's creative processes, the means he employs, the balance which he demands, the separateness of father-motherhood into fathers and mothers, which must interchange in balance in order to unite and as one. And that applies to every corpuscle of the body as well as it applies to every individual entity as a whole.